Hello there, and welcome to another edition of A Lot of Help with James Lott JR. I'm James Lott JR here on JLJ Media. I'm the JLJ of JLJs, all of them. And we're here talking about a very interesting case that's gone on for decades that me being here in Los Angeles, remember from way back when to today, because there's new evidence coming out and things talking about possibly letting these two gentlemen who currently are serving life without parole behind bars to have parole. We'll talk about Lyle and Erik Menéndez, of course. And I brought in someone, a friend of mine from the UK. He's here talking. He's a forensic psychiatrist, psych for sore minds. My friend, Dr. Sohom. Hello, doctor.
Mr. JLJ, how are you doing?
I'm fine. I'm good. Thank you. Thanks for being on the show. I wanted your take on this case, and there's a couple of areas we want to talk about. We're not going to go through the whole case and do all that, folks. Don't worry about that. But I have a friend who was a trial member, who was a juror for one of the cases, who wrote books on it. I have friends who knew of them, and so it was a really weird thing here. And it also surrounded Beverly Hills, which is, as you know, is known as the place of opulence and wealth and brats and privilege and all that stuff mixed together. And this case brought all of that to the forefront. So overall, as you've perused the case and looked it through, what are some of your big general thoughts about it?
I suppose the one thing that really stands out to me is that as perpetrators, as people that kill their parents, they're very, very unusual, aren't they? So people who commit murder in general tend to come from some sort of trauma, or whether it's poverty or neglect. It's quite unusual to get people who are that privileged to do something like this, simply because the average rich person doesn't have to commit that kind of crime except for potentially fraud. So that's one thing that really stands out. And I suppose the fact that it's been out of the news cycle for so long and the brothers have been facing life in prison and then suddenly everything's resurfaced, that's also highly unusual.
Yeah, after all these years, and stuff. And my friend who was a juror has actually been talking recently about how she's been feeling about this case too. And public opinion is starting to change a bit. It's starting to change a bit to like, well, maybe they should come out. Maybe they did. Maybe they really were abused. I think at the time there was a lot of just like, you're rich and you're privileged and you must have did it for these reasons.
Well, I think it polarizes people, doesn't it? Because there's two different ways of looking at it. You can look at it in exactly the way that you said: rich, privileged, white people who are multimillionaires through their family wealth. Why would they do something as horrific as that? They deserve the electric chair. They deserve to be executed, blah blah blah. That's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is, were they actually abused? And was the abuse like a retrospective, desperate attempt to try and reduce their culpability, or were they actually victims of abuse? In which case, it's really unfair that society in general is victim shaming or not believing them. So there's quite a lot of unknowns. Really, it's very kind of layered and complicated, I'd say.
Yeah, we're gonna go into that right now because back in the 80s and even in the early 90s, abuse still wasn't it was starting to come out when it came to just abuse in general, that kids were abused, people were abused. There was a lot of language that's happening now in today's lens that was happening then, especially when it came to domestic parental abuse to boys, that kind of thing. My fans notice I'm a survivor of violent assault and violent assaults, sexual and otherwise, from my younger years. And at the time, no one was gonna believe me. I was told, well, you're a guy. They don't, they're not gonna believe you. So I personally understand some of the feelings around all of that from back then, especially because, like I said, we can't look at it at the lens of today. But back then, there was a lot of just like, shut it down. You don't talk about it, whatever. So I want to talk to you about the relationship with their dad. And what are some of your thoughts on what you were finding looking at their case?
Sure. Well, firstly, I'm very sorry to hear what you've been through, James. I had no idea.
Thank you.
I suppose for me, there's two separate elements. There's the kind of emotional abuse and the potential sexual abuse. I think we have to say potential because nobody really knows definitively whether it happened or not. The emotional abuse is far more certain. So Jose really pushed Erik towards trying to be like a championship tennis star. And I suppose it's quite complicated, isn't it? Because some of the best sports people in the world needed that, and probably wouldn't have been as successful without that. The case that jumps to my mind immediately is Richard Williams and the Williams sisters. Without his kind of drive, would they have achieved that much success? Probably not. But was that abuse? I don't think it was, because I think the ultimate issue is, first of all, is the kid as gifted as the father or the mother wants them to be? And if they are and they're able to channel that, then you've got the ingredients for success. But if they're not, if they fail to live up to the expectations, then that potentially is quite abusive, isn't it? Because there's a fine line between encouraging a kid to be the best tennis player they can be and being very disappointed in that child and making that obvious, and then making them constantly live for that approval. And even as I'm a big NBA fan, I can think of a few cases like Dwayne Wade comes to mind, and Ja Morant. They both were heavily kind of trained by their fathers, but it feels like Erik possibly didn't actually want that in his life, because if you're a young sportsman, especially if you're quite talented and quite successful, there's a difference between liking the idea of being a famous tennis player or a famous NBA star, and it's very different to actually having to get up morning after morning after morning after morning and sacrificing all your life and your childhood. A lot of children won't be able to cope with that. So I suppose we're just looking at that part of it. And also, I suppose Lyle to a lesser degree. I know he was successful. I know he went to Princeton, and I know that he clearly had behavioral issues, plagiarism, lots of controversy. So that gives me the impression of kids who are privileged and lucky in some respects. When I say lucky, I mean they were given opportunities that other children won't have, but also probably felt emotionally abused in other ways.
Well, we have to bring in the component that his father, immigrated here. They're from another country. We know, you and I both know, coming from immigrant backgrounds, sometimes they just know they want you to make it. They are harder on you. They come from different kinds of culture where it's just like there is no coddling you or whatever. It's like, oh, it's gonna be okay, and second place is fine. Like we don't. I was not raised that way. I wasn't. Second place was bad. I mean, not everybody got a medal. You had to be first place, and I know I was an overachiever of some sorts. That's probably what led me here today. When I was a kid, because I was told by my parents and godparents and grandparents, you have to work hard all the time. I think there's a component in there too, isn't there? So a little bit of that, just kind of like that hard work ethic kind of thing.
Also, I suppose it depends on the resilience of the individual child, right? You could literally tell two different children the same thing and try and put them through a training regime, whether that's education if you're Indian or like sport, whatever it is, and one child will thrive in that environment and one will completely crumble.
That's so true. Also, another thing I think of is the Jacksons. Their father Joe was notoriously hard on them, and and the kids still say, I mean, they all kind of say, yeah, there was some abuse of some sort, but I mean, we would have had Michael or Janet, or any of them. I mean, literally, there was. I think you saw talent in them. I really think you saw talent in them, and on some level, you have to practice. You have to work hard to make, especially in this business, to make it, and they made it. I mean, but then there's issues of abuse. I'm sure there's abuse in there. I'm sure at the same time.
So what I think the risk is that you end up with a successful individual in their field, a child prodigy, but there's a damaged relationship with the parent. So even though the parents push them to the top, there's some resentment, I think, sometimes. And looking at the Menendez brothers, I mean, Erik didn't reach superstardom when it came to tennis, so all you're left behind with is this kind of broken relationship.
Well, also I heard he was really hard on them. What they claimed, he was very, very hard on them. And so some folks may say, well, I didn't kill my parents because they, I mean, I've joked about it, but I never did it. And so now I kind of get your psychiatrist hat in here. For instance, so are there, I think I've asked you supposed for another show, are there just bad seeds that this was unleashed, or were they, or in some opinions, can't people be driven to doing stuff they don't know?
Yeah. I think it can be either situation. Generally speaking, people who are bad seeds, I suppose the clinical term for that would be antisocial personality disorder. So I'm talking about people who lack empathy, who are quite impulsive, who either don't know or don't care about the difference between right and wrong. people, you know, who lash out with aggression and violence, they tend to have a pattern of that behavior. It's quite unusual for somebody to not have any kind of criminal record, or you know, even events like that weren't dealt with by the police. They didn't go into the criminal justice system. It's unlikely for an individual to not have that and then to escalate to something like killing. So it's possible, but it's really unlikely. As to whether somebody can be pushed to do something like this, absolutely. I mean, you do see, you know, crimes that are committed in the heat of passion, revenge attacks. If what the Menendez brothers are saying is true, and if they were sexually abused, I suppose my point would be that they were in their 20s. So, I mean, do they really believe that their lives were in danger? I know that they said during the criminal trial that their father had physically threatened to kill them. I suppose you can make an argument. On both sides, couldn't you? You could say that if you're in your 20s, then you're not going to be. It's not like you're a child that can't resist the physical advances of a stronger individual, you know, especially if they're athletic young men. But on the other hand, I suppose if they've been groomed or intimidated over years, then they might, even if their father wasn't physically able to overpower them, they still might feel that, they might genuinely feel that threat. What do you think?
Well, there's that whole thing of because they were young. I mean, like one was like late teens, but you know, Lyle's in his early 20s. That the brain isn't fully formed. I don't know how you feel about this. The brain isn't fully formed until 25. You know, there's a whole push here in America about, you know, raising age limits to like, no, they shouldn't make things at 18, 19, 21, even 21. I think it should be 25. So I don't personally, I used to be in the nursing field, but I don't know anything about that kind of stuff. I feel like that is young. I mean, now that I'm old, I feel like it's young. I mean, that's just to me. I'm like, wow, there are a lot of things I didn't know at 21 that I thought I knew. I mean, I know now at 54, but like that to me, that's still young. That is young. I mean, that's anything
That's
under
young.
25 is young.
But the counter argument, I suppose, and I'm not sure about the US. I believe it's different in different states, but in the UK, the age of criminal responsibility is 10, and in most of the rest of Europe, it's 14, sometimes 15. So I think at 21, I agree that you're not fully matured in your late teens and early 20s. Definitely believe in that. And I don't think your personality is fully formed, but I think you know the difference between right and wrong. And you know.
Oh, I agree with that part. Yeah, I mean, I agree with that part. But I guess it's just one of those things where, I mean, you can't be stunted. I think it's still I guess you can be stunted older too. I guess you can still be stunted. I mean, I don't know. I guess it's when I hear things about that, I go, well, yeah, it does seem young. Everything seems young at that to me. Everything now that I'm older, it does seem young. So I don't know. I don't know if it's just hindsight I'm adding in here.
Yeah,
I don't know. That's a good question. That's a good question. I don't know. That's a very good question, Dr. Doss. I'm not sure either. I don't know how I feel that. I just think they were young. They were young. They were impressionable, and they were possibly in a very heightened situation. I mean, every single day. I mean, from what they're saying, from what they're claiming. So let's go into actually their reaction and stuff after the parents, you know, all that kind of the parents were killed and all that kind of stuff, and
yeah.
how they went from there.
I suppose that's another element that really interests me, because from what I've read, they reacted very bizarrely, didn't they? So they didn't appear to be grieving, considering their parents had been killed. So before they'd admitted it,
Right.
One of the theories was because they were trying to live this lavish kind of party lifestyle and spending all this money, that in itself makes them guilty. We know they killed their parents retrospectively, but what I think is interesting is that I don't think you can make that assumption with that information, because even though, well, I'll put it like this: if there was a situation where they felt physically, emotionally, or even sexually abused and oppressed, and then suddenly the people that caused that, especially their father, is out of the picture, then you could say that they've just suddenly got this newfound freedom that they're not used to. They've been, you know, restricted and had all these boundaries, so they're just going a bit wild. It's a bit like rebelling, really, when, like, you know, a kid leaves home and they kind of act wildly if they had very, very strict parents. I think that's a version. I think that could be seen as a version of that. And to take it even further, you could even say that if they did kill their parents, then it would be it wouldn't make sense to kind of react in a very odd way that's going to draw attention to them.
Yeah.
So I suppose I conclude by saying that I don't think you can make any inferences about somebody's guilt or innocence because of the way they react to a strange situation.
Well, isn't that always a thing in true crime? People's reactions, and that some people who are innocent, I mean, they are innocent, but they react a certain way. I mean, like, isn't there different? Aren't there different kinds of reasons why anybody reacts to anything?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, there is, and there's certainly been cases that I've made videos on and that I've given reactions to where people have been assumed to be guilty because they're acting in a very odd way, and
Yes.
then it turns out that they weren't guilty. And I think that's because nobody really knows what it's like to grieve in that situation, because it's such an unusual situation, to have a family member killed. Just
Yes.
because you're not, sitting there crying on TV during the press release doesn't mean you're guilty. It could just mean that you're literally overwhelmed, or you're in denial, or you might just be quite a stoic individual person. Not everybody expresses grief in the same way. Some people are devastated inside, but they just don't cry because it's just not what they do.
There are a couple people in my life I've never seen cry ever. I've known them decades. I'm a big crybaby. I cried everything. I cried commercials now. I cried everything. I'm just like a big. I get sentimental. I cried everything.
Are you still a crybaby nowadays?
What?
Are you still a crybaby nowadays?
Yeah, I am. I mean, I'm a very strong person. I can hold together. I'm the one that takes care of everything. But I'll cry I mean, like, it can be a TV show and there's a scene on a TV show and I'll be sobbing or whatever. Or I don't know, my daughter says something to me that, just like the other day, we're talking about her being a baby and she's raising a baby, and that's how I think about that. I'm like, you were a great baby, and now I'm like, they all laugh, they all make fun of me. But I'm like, I start crying and stuff. I've gotten softer as I gotten older, Dr. Dawes. I don't know. I was a hard ass. I don't know what's wrong with me. I've noticed in the last 10 years, I've gotten a lot softer. And to me, having girls, I think that's what it does. I'm a girl dad. I think that's what it is. They've softened me, to a point. I'm like, I don't need much. 'Cause I was always the one who was like the deep voice, and it's like, yeah, you don't do this, and I can talk back to you, and all this kind of stuff. Now I'm not quite everything. Not cried everything. Which is fine, folks. Men can cry. It's okay for men to cry. Let it out. I do. But I know folks who don't. And I also know people who, you're right, just on regular levels, grieve. And I always tell you, there's no one way to grieve. You grieve a certain way, and it's fine. But I know in heightened situations that are very highly unusual, not everybody has somebody killed in their family, or not everybody has somebody kidnapped, or like that kind of stuff. It's your brain probably can't compute. Like, there's nowhere to go. Sometimes either when something like that happens, right? I guess, right?
Yeah, and also, I suppose, to kind of flip it on its head a little bit, there've been loads of cases where a perpetrator has been responsible, and at like in the immediate aftermath, they've killed somebody, like a family member, but they've been on TV making the appeals to the police, and they seem genuinely quite upset,
Yes.
and then the evidence comes up against them afterwards. So that again adds to the point that you can't judge a book by its cover. You can't judge how somebody's guilt or innocence by the way they appear.
But there's some people, some of these cases you talk about, I mean, you would think they did not do it, and they were like, so. I mean, is there a term for that? I don't know. I mean, I don't know, because where they're so convincing, we're just like, wow, I really believed you that you didn't do it, and you're looking for your wife. Meanwhile, your wife's, in the trunk. I had no idea, but I totally believed you. You sold it. Is that just a good actor? I mean, is there a term for that? Or
I don't think there's really a psychological term as such, apart from just being manipulative,
okay.
conning, deceptive. But interestingly, psychopaths, not everyone that does that is a psychopath, but psychopaths would be much more adept at doing that almost by definition. They're able to switch off their emotions, they lack fear, they lack empathy, plus they're manipulative.
So we're talking about evidence and things that are happening, and one of the things that also caught your attention was the letter that Lyle
Yeah.
wrote. So let's talk about that. So what were some of your thoughts on that?
So when I was reading about this case, I vaguely heard of it before you mentioned it, but I didn't know the details. It didn't really make it across the pond as much. But when I was reading up on it, and then I read something about a letter that was it Lyle sent to his cousin explaining that he was being abused. And my first sort of reaction was, surely this is really solid proof that that was true, that that he was a victim of abuse, because it would take a lot of forethought and pre-planning to have done that in advance. But then when I read more about it, it was only 8 months before the actual killing. And I think it is possible for somebody to be able to wait 8 months before they carry out something like that.
Okay.
If it was like 5 years or 10 years, then I don't think it's not impossible, but it's very, very unlikely. But 8 months, and did you say he was in his early 20s at the time?
Yeah.
And again, I struggle to see how somebody in their early 20s allows this abuse and would, write a complaint letter to their cousin about it rather than do anything about it. What do you think?
I know it's a good question. That's another good one too. It's like I'm trying to think. I back then we used to write letters. You have folks who wrote letters back then.
See, I could see like a 15-year-old or a 16-year-old potentially doing it.
Well, that's if they're open though. Like when I was 15, I wasn't open when I was 15 or 16. I would have said shit to anybody. I wouldn't have said anything. I mean, I was so tight-lipped. If I had a cousin I was close to who lived near me, I might possibly whisper it or something. I don't know if I'd write a letter though.
Yeah.
I'm just saying for me as a dude back then at that age, and I was being abused. I didn't write letters to nobody. I didn't tell anybody. I just wouldn't have done it. I just wouldn't have.
In some ways, it almost sounds too convenient, doesn't it? It almost sounds like this
right.
is physical.
Right. So I don't want to count that either, because maybe he did. Maybe he was reaching out in this weird way to kind of, not weird, just in a way to like almost say, because to me, when you say something, then it's real. And so and even if you write it, that's what I mean by saying something. Now I was aware of that even as a kid, but there are a lot of things I kept secret that maybe my siblings and I talked about with each other. Obviously, I'm sure his brother talked about it. Or maybe a trusted cousin here and there, but that again, I wouldn't have written a letter to my cousin in Buffalo, New York, across the country. And we used to write letters to each other about Def Leppard or whatever, but I never wrote about the abuse. Yeah. Just me. I wouldn't have had the courage to do that. I just wouldn't have. Yeah, I just wouldn't have. And I feel like now if I was with her and we were talking and I was upset and something slipped out, that seemed more likely in my case, I guess. As a guy, girls were a little different. I think. I don't know. I just we weren't raised in that time period to be open about our feelings. We just weren't. And you didn't tell your parents. Yeah. You know that. I mean, you just didn't. Just the parents did stuff. They did what they did. You took it, and you didn't tell anybody, really.
Yeah. I think the whole concept of an individual child's well-being was not as strong back then, right? No. So even like, now I've got 2 young kids, as you know, and like when we go on holiday, we have to think about how to entertain the kids, and we have to think about their moods and what makes them happy and what doesn't.
Nobody cared about us back then. Our moods makes us happy. Come on, Dr. Johnson. When I was a kid, and this is back in the Stone Age, we were latchkey. I was allowed to be called latchkey kid. Literally, we went on vacation. The parents were over here doing whatever. They're probably smoking, drinking over here. And we were doing all dangerous shit, like playing with metal toys and jumping off bridges, and nobody cared. Just be back by 6 before it gets dark, and we eat. I mean, other than that, I have scars down my legs from skateboarding and skate. I mean, they didn't care. Here's some stuff for it. Go walk it off. I mean, like our parents did not care about our feelings and how do you? Okay, James. So do you really want to do this? No, you're coming with us. That's what we do. I'm right. It's like that's what we do. There was no asking. I mean, so back then it was a little rougher. I mean, we grew up. I mean, I grew up fine. I mean, whatever. But it's a little rougher.
I totally agree. So now it's our summer holidays in the UK, and our weeks are kind of planned out with some sort of activity for my kids, either every day or every other day. Whereas back when I had summer holidays, it was pretty much like you said, be home. You have to do this much studying because my parents were Indian. You have to be home time. Anything else you sort out by yourself. You're not allowed to watch more than 2 hours of TV. So either you find something to do or you do nothing. There's no.
Well, I'm sure you also, when you went on holiday with your parents, you just went wherever they told you. They didn't say, "So, home, where do you want to go for holiday?" No, if we're going to India to see the relatives, you just went and you did whatever they told you, right?
Yeah. And even just like day trips, we didn't. So like now I'll take my kids to the park or like go to a theme park maybe. Whereas when we were during our, not even just the holidays, even the weekends, my parents would go and see their friends and we tagged along. And if we were lucky, there were other kids our age and we had to.
Right. If you're lucky. If you're lucky, he said something key. If you're lucky, there'll be kids your age that you actually would want to hang out with. I mean, that's the other thing too. You're kind of forced together. Sometimes you bond over that. We're like, why are we here or whatever. But there's some kids. I was like, oh, you guys are nerds. I couldn't do it. I wasn't a nerd, so But anyway, but in all seriousness, back then it was just different rules, and I think I take that into account for the Menendez Bros because they come from a Cuban father and the immigrant thing here. He made lots of money. so they had money. So now it's a whole status thing. You know, you have to do well here because I think on some level, when you're an immigrant, you're always an immigrant. On some level, you're always aware of what you're not, right? So you kind of overcompensate in some ways. I think that's. I mean, I don't know if you agree with that. I kind of agree with that. I think that happens.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose if you come from a background where opportunities and privilege isn't expected or isn't given to you, and then you work really, really hard to make something of your life and to earn money, you don't want to, you know, it's unacceptable for your kids to be lazy in your eyes. Absolutely.
Yes, completely. That's what it is. But do you think so? The letter. So right now, I guess our thoughts on the letter are: it could be possible. It could be a setup. It could be possible. I guess that's our thoughts on the letter.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, obviously, I can't. I am speculating, but I suppose if I had to choose on balance, I think it's even speaking out loud to you. I think it sounds more like a setup, like something that's fake than is something that's genuine.
Yeah. So I mean, only they will know for the truth themselves, for sure. Well, now people are saying people are saying they should be paroled.
Yeah.
You know, they should be overturned, and that there was some new evidence. I don't know all the new evidence are coming, but there's stuff coming up, and just now we know what about abuse. Now we do have the language, the examples also about, again, all that kind of abuse that did happen a lot in a lot of homes.
Yeah.
Um, like you said, even rich homes. I mean, any thoughts on that? I mean, obviously, we don't know what could happen or what happened, but any thoughts on that?
About whether they should be paroled or not.
Yeah, it's like, because you do a lot of true crime stuff. You're a forensic
Yeah.
psychiatrist. It's like, is this a good idea? Is this not a good
Yeah.
idea?
It's a great question. It's hard to answer. I'll tell you my thoughts. I think, you know, just to sum up what we've already been saying, in my view, there's two potential scenarios here. Either they probably did feel like they were emotionally abused by their father, who was a pushy immigrant, but they weren't sexually abused, in which case I think that even though you can understand some of the ways that they were disgruntled, taking their parents' life is absolutely 100% horrific and unacceptable, especially considering they killed a mother as well. That's something we're not really talked about. There doesn't seem to
Yeah,
be,
they did.
even in that scenario, there doesn't seem to be any kind of reasonable, understandable cause of why they did that, right? So that's one possibility, in which case I absolutely don't think they should be up for parole, especially for the fact that they were, you know, 22 years old, they were rich, they were privileged, they could have waited a little bit and, you know, made a life of their own. Or the other possibility is all of that plus they were sexually abused. And again, I don't want to be seen to not be believing victims, and I think we should always be on the side of victims in general. But in this one particular case, I'm finding it hard to believe because the letter seems a little bit too convenient, number one. And probably more importantly than that, they were grown men at the time. And I think that on balance, it's hard to believe that they genuinely thought their lives were in danger. So I suppose there's two out of those two possibilities. If I had to, it's really hard to decide between the two, but if I had to hedge my bet, I would say that probably I don't think that they should be up for parole.
That's the thing. So if they were let out, do you think at this point, it's been going like 30 years, whatever? Was 1996? Well, close to that. It's getting close to that. Do you think they would be a menace to anybody in society if they were let out?
No, I don't. The reason being is because, first of all, they don't have like a long history of violence that we know about. It's like literally this one, even though it's a very, very extreme thing, it was a one-off incident. So they don't have like a pattern of repeat behavior, number one. And probably more importantly than that, they're going to be under so much scrutiny that they basically know they can't step a foot wrong, you know, whether it's actually being seen by your parole officer, or just the fact that people will know who they are in the public, I think, and the fact that they've spent most of their lives behind bar. I think that they'll, regardless of any of their internal kind of values or beliefs or thoughts or ethics, I think they will walk the straight and narrow. Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree that. I agree with you too. Like they're gonna watch as we say, are their P's and Q's. They're gonna watch all that if they got out. I mean, I'd be very surprised if they didn't, right? Because the whole world will be watching them.
Yeah.
They'll be kind of like OJ. I always think of OJ Simpson. Yeah, he's laying low. He's not doing nothing right now. Like, there's nothing going on. That's another case. I know you know that case, of course.
Although, didn't he? Am I remembering this right? Didn't he commit some armed robbery?
He was trying to take back his own stuff or something. He
That's right.
went to prison for a few years, but he got
Yeah.
out, and he's literally been laying low this whole time. Like He wrote a book called "What If I Did It." I remember that book came out. I was like, oh my God. But he somehow just like living his life somewhere. I don't know what he's doing, but like the whole, I'm saying the whole world, is watching him, especially white folks, black folks, everybody's watching to see what he's going to do, and he hasn't done anything really. He's just been kind of laying low. So I feel like there'd be a similar case of if they get out, you can't sneeze wrong. You gotta make sure everything is in a row while you're out there doing stuff, and prove that you're worthy. And the public want to know, prove that you're worthy of being out, that we did the right thing and let you out. I think that's kind of part of it. I mean, these cases they seem so extraordinary to me, and you deal with a lot of these cases. But this is a question for you as we start to close out. Don't they, a lot of them come from just regular, ordinary stuff, though? A lot of these folks are ordinary folks that go into these extraordinary situations. Is that it? Or I mean, I feel like it's just like, it just seems like they come out of nowhere, but then there are a lot of these cases running around.
So are you asking me basically, can anybody who appears to come from a normal background do something like this? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, kind of like, just like, it just seems like it's not that extraordinary. It's extraordinary circumstance somebody does something, but is it that extraordinary? I mean,
I suppose coming from a dysfunctional family absolutely is not that extraordinary. Doing something as extreme as killing your own parents absolutely is extraordinary. I think that there's, from my experience of rehabilitating mentally disordered offenders, I think that there are two camps of people. There's those that commit low-level kind of regular violence. So I mentioned before, antisocial personality disorder, and over time it escalates. Sometimes they gain confidence because there's little legal consequences of their actions, so they become bolder and bolder, and they escalate, and they go on to do something extreme like killing. But just like this case, sometimes you get people that completely unexpected, completely out of the blue. And I think they fall into, there's two different motivations. Either it's completely spontaneous and opportunistic, so they didn't plan to do it. It's just they lost their temper in a rage. Or they're so overconfident, usually quite narcissistic, that they don't think that they'll be caught. They think they're clever enough to evade the police. So I think there's a specific kind of scenarios where this might happen.
I just want people to know that, and we also know that there are folks who go through abuse and trauma and don't do anything like this. I mean, so that happens. Like, clearly, I'm a person, I never did myself either. So I mean, my parents are alive and they're still kicking. But I mean, but we do, going through stuff. It's the brain. Your brain it's the brain, and when you have emotional abuse, which now more and more we're talking about that more. There's other stuff, physical and sexual. That's right there in your face. But emotional, verbal abuse, words and things can really hurt people for a long time. We're seeing that, right? We're seeing that. And can drive people to do all kinds of situations. So thank you, Dr. Doss, for coming on and talking with me about the Menendez brothers. We're going to follow this case and see what happens. And if some stuff comes up that's really, extraordinary, we'll come back and talk about it and see what your thoughts are on it.
Absolutely. I'd love to.
Tell folks where they can find you and your practice.
Okay, yeah. So the best place is probably my YouTube channel, A Psych for Sore Minds, where I dissect these kinds of cases, so high-profile cases. Sometimes I talk about kind of trending topics in crime or in mental illness. So you can find me there, and you can buy my book, In Two Minds, which is my professional memoirs, where I dissect some of the most kind of shocking or heartbreaking cases of people that I've assessed to be an expert witness in their trials.
Yes, very much. Check those out, please. And you can follow me. We're all James Lott Jr. Sold at James Lott Jr. on all social media platforms. A Lot of Help is on Facebook and a lot of help.com. Everybody, please take care of yourselves, and we'll talk to you soon.
Cheers, James.